Great. So thank you. If you are tuning in live, drop a hashtag live to this live. I'm really excited about this one. I feel like we get questions about this all the time in the group, whether what type of curve you have, where you should strengthen, where you should stretch. And I feel like there's been a lot more talk about this lately, especially when we're talking about doing exercises, doing core exercises like side plank. Should we do them on both sides? Should we bias one side? Should we just do one side of an exercise when we're doing strength training in the gym? So these are all great questions. And I think fundamentally they come back to talking more about our alignment and how that contributes. So I'm going to go into some detail of that. We're going to go through some drawing, some explanation together so that we can really answer this question for you. Although I am going to say we don't have too many definite answers on this. And though some people may act as if they do, when you do look at the research, there's still a lot of variability to tell us which side is stronger and which side is weaker with scoliosis. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. So firstly, if you are new to our group, my name is Beth Terranova. I am a physical therapist. I am a strength coach. I have scoliosis as well. And my job is I really help people with scoliosis to get started in fitness routines, workout routines that help them to get stronger and support their curve. So if you don't know me, that is who I am. I don't know if I mentioned I'm also trained in Schroth physical therapy. So a lot of my background comes from that. And a lot of what I'm talking about does relate back to kind of the Schroth method and how we classify curves and what we think in terms of where we should strengthen and where we should work. But I'll talk about how there can be some variability in this for sure. So what I'd like to start by doing is just go into a little bit more detail about scoliosis itself. What characteristics of scoliosis do we want to pay attention to when we're exercising, and what different curve types may relate to different aspects of our workouts? So I'm just bringing up my screen so that we can talk about this a little bit first, and then we will roll into answering a lot of the questions. So if you don't have a question, if you have a question that maybe you haven't submitted yet, or if a question comes up as we're talking through this, please feel free to drop it in the comments. I have the comments open so that I can answer your questions too. So one of the important things with scoliosis that is really important to consider is that scoliosis is three-dimensional. So what does that mean? That means that scoliosis is more than just what we see on our x-ray, which is on the x-ray, we see mainly the side bend of the curve. And that's actually the measurement of the Cobb angle. So that's the first one. When we look at the body from straight on, we see that side bend of the curve. Now, don't forget that scoliosis also comes with rotation. So I've drawn these are my very poorly drawn little spine vertebrae, but you can see that they're usually in this straight alignment. But with scoliosis, they actually rotate. So if we're looking at them from the top down, we'll see that they are rotated. And often that's what creates what we see as the prominence on the side of our body, because the vertebrae rotates. The ribs are attached to the vertebrae, and that's what creates the ribs wanting to stick out. Then the last thing, and one thing that we see pretty less, is the translation of the spine. So this is a little bit harder to explain, but basically because of the rotation, we also see some changes of the alignment of the vertebra itself. So they don't stack up one on top of the other anymore. They stack up almost on a little bit of an offset from each other. So basically think about if you had some stacking blocks, like those kids blocks, and you were stacking them a little bit on an angle from each other as you go. That would kind of represent a little bit the translation that we have. So the translation can also contribute to seeing that prominence as well. So these are the three dimensions that we see. And this is important to know because it teaches us that we can't just look at scoliosis in one plane. And I think that's where some of the approaches for scoliosis are in addressing these other dimensions, is that they're just looking at the side bend. So when we're looking at, okay, my spine is bent. So if I just work on, if these muscles are pulling too tight and these muscles are not pulling enough, well, if I just work on strengthening these, then that will balance out my spine. And that's not exactly how we think it really works, right? We know that we also have to work on the rotation and the translation. So how do we do that? So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Let's talk a little bit now about different curve types that exist. And I know there was a lot of questions about C curves, S curves, what type of curve do I have? So I'm going to go through that. So basically, we have S curves. So a lot of us have, we often call it a reverse S curve. And it's actually, we're looking at, you can see left is on the left side of my screen, right is on the right. I use the little left and right to markate them separately so you know what you're looking at. But we can actually have S curves that are different primary curves. So you can have an S curve with a bigger thoracic curve. So that may fall into our 3 curve or our non-3, non-4 pattern. You could have an S curve with more of a lumbar curve that's bigger. So that would actually fall into our, how we would describe in Schroth as a 4 curve pattern. So basically the difference is that which curve is the primary versus which is the secondary. Usually the primary curve will pull the trunk towards it. So if you have a lumbar primary curve, you may notice that your upper body shifts over to the left and your lower body shifts over to the right. Your hips shift over to the right. If you have a primary thoracic curve, like a 3 curve, you may notice your trunk shifts over to the right and your pelvis wants to shift over to the left. So that's something important to notice, because I think that why we see a lot of conflicts on terms of the research as to which muscles are more active around the curve is because we have all fall into S curve category, but actually different types of curves, right? So I think that somebody who has a lumbar primary curve may have a different pattern of muscle activation than someone who has a thoracic primary. So I think that's why sometimes when we see different research, that doesn't give us a concrete answer as to which is stronger or which is weaker. Because if you think about it, if we think about where our heads will line up, we know that with the thoracic primary curve, kind of our weight is shifted over to the right. So we may be putting more weight through our right side. That may be causing partly our right thoracic muscles to work even harder. Whereas if we have a left lumbar curve, we may be putting more work onto that left side, which means the left lower back muscles are working harder. So I think that some of that imbalances relates to that. I think that's a big piece of maybe where we need to go a little further when we're looking at the research as health professionals as to, okay, what type of curve is this and how does that affect the muscle activation? Now, the last one I'll talk about a little bit is the single curve. Some of you may have C curve. So the C curve basically is you have one curve that doesn't really have too much, may have a little compensation for, not too much, but basically the pelvis will shift opposite that main curve. So there are thoracolumbar curves, lumbar curves that may take this C shape. And I think this C shape, if it's truly that thoracolumbar lumbar, will tend to be a little bit more like that 4 curve in terms of how it presents. So if we break it up and someone's asking about if you have a backwards S. So these are all backwards S type curve. So we're looking at all of those. That's the more common type. Those who have a forward facing S is actually less common. So when I'm talking about here, you can see that I have, this is the right side and this is the left side when we're talking about. So these are all kind of looking from, let's say, behind the person. I hope that clarifies for you what we're talking about. We'll even give our models a little bit of hair so we can show that we're looking at them from the back. As you can see, this is very complex, and that's a big reason why, as you know, I'm a big advocate of having someone help you in terms of building your exercise program, someone who knows scoliosis and has experience with it, because there's a lot to break down in terms of where are your ribs hanging out, where is your pelvis hanging out, and how does that relate to your exercise program. So this is why, you can see, just trying to explain this in a way that makes sense, it can be a little bit complex. So I hope that clarifies. With my, in general, kind of what I see as I work with people when we're talking about these primary curves, I tend to see that with the thoracic curves, we'll see sometimes more tension. Oh, that's a big marker. Hold on, let's bring that down a little bit. I'll tend to see more tension around the convexity on that side. So on the right side, convexity tends to be where people notice more pain. But sometimes I do also have people on the concave side, which is this side that's a little bit more kind of pinched in here, may also have some pain there too. So when we look at the research, actually tells us that the muscles in the thoracic curve on this side, the convex, are working harder. They're more active. And they're actually a little bit more stretched out as well. And you can think about too, it makes sense with the curve, as like the muscles are coming over this side, they're going to be a little bit more stretched out. Whereas on this side, they're going to be a little bit shorter and more tensed on that area. So this can also be as well. So what I think sometimes people get confused here is that often we'll say, okay, if a muscle is tight, does that also mean that it is strong? And if a muscle is lengthened, does it mean it's weak? And actually, muscles kind of live along a spectrum where they can be a mix. So you can have a tight muscle that is strong. You can have a tight muscle that is weak. You can have a lengthened muscle that is strong. And you can have a lengthened muscle that is weak. So sometimes this is where I think maybe some of the models of working with scoliosis to say, okay, we need to strengthen those right side thoracic muscles because they are weaker because they're stretched, may not necessarily be the case. Sometimes those muscles are actually overworked and they're working overtime, and they actually need help from the concave muscles in order to help support them. Right. So that's also very important that we have the strength of the concave muscles too to help support. And this is actually more common in terms of the lumbar curve. When we look at lumbar primary curves and we do research on those, we do find that the weak side of the curve, so in here on the concave side, tends to be weaker than the convex. So a lot of times we will do exercises to try to strengthen this muscle, but that's actually funny because it's a short muscle, a tight muscle that's weak, right? So it falls kind of into this category here. So just to say that we can have a lot of variability in terms of tight versus weak side to side, and we don't have everyone that always fits into that exact pattern. So someone is asking, I just want to clarify. Someone's asking about the curve, S curve. So I feel like I tried to exaggerate a little bit here to make clear the difference, but you could also have this 3 curve where you do have a little bit more of a lumbar curve. So maybe that's not clear from the picture, but I was just trying to show the difference between the 2 types of S curves, let's say. So I was trying to show that 3 curve, you are pulled a little bit more towards the right by that thoracic curve, and the 4 curve, you're pulled a little bit more towards the left. So I hope that clarifies one of the questions that we had in the chat. So one of the big takeaways here is that it can be hard to really give a specific instruction for someone with scoliosis to work on this. So, it can be very variable. Sorry, having some computer glitches here. Okay, I think we should be good now. Trying to bring back up the comments if people have comments. Okay. There can be a lot of variability, right? Because I've also worked with some people who have primary lumbar curve, but are having more issue with that thoracic curve, right? Because of that rotation and those aspects here as well. So how do we find a balance where we can strengthen our muscles evenly? Because a lot of what people may have trouble with, and a lot of what people have expressed to me is that, well, when I work out and I do exercises that are using both sides, I really feel like my convex side is doing all the work. So how can we find that balance? So one of the first things I think is important is to learn about our curve. So that's a little bit what we're doing here today, is to learn about, how our curve lines up, right? Because once we know what type of curve we have, then that can give us some information as to how can we now align our body considering that. So when I talk about alignment, I talk about using blocks. So if we were to just stack up those blocks, right? And we may use 3, we may use 4, depending on your type of curve, but let's just use our ribs, low back, pelvis. We can even give the shoulder a block. Let's be fair to the shoulder here. Give the shoulder a block. All right. So using the blocks helps us to kind of look at, all right, how with scoliosis do our blocks line up? So let's take that primary thoracic curve, that 3 curve, S curve. And what we may find there is that the ribs, let me just get you a right and left perspective here. So what we may find is that the rib block is shifted over to the right and rotated back on the right. Right? That's what many of us see, that rotation there. Then we may say that the shoulders are rotated. Many of you with right thoracic curve will tell me, oh, I feel like my right shoulder blade is kind of being pushed forward. And it actually is. It's being pushed forward by that rib block, is kind of in the way of where the shoulder blade wants to live, right? And then we may also see that the low back and the pelvis, that lumbar curve here, and the pelvis are also kind of shifting over here to the left. So what does that mean? That means when you're going into the gym and let's say your curve is hanging out, somewhere like this, you're leaning more towards your right side. So you may feel the muscles working more on that right side because you're not in a balance. So one of the first things that I teach my clients is how to find that balance, how to find their posture alignment first. So basically taking those blocks and thinking about stacking them up one on top of the other. So we have some good videos for this, but really just starting by finding equal weight between your feet, finding the center of your pelvis, and then making sure your ribs are stacking up over your pelvis. And you may have more specific cues depending on your particular curve, but basically we go through this progression with each of our individual clients to kind of help them find that alignment to start out with. So by doing this, I think the first thing that happens is when you are working out more in that alignment, you're able to use weight more evenly, which means you can find activation more evenly side to side. I think that's one piece. I think also too, an important thing for us to remember is with our curves is that rotation and that translation. So with that, we don't get as much of a correction with this block stacking technique. We have to also incorporate elongating the spine. So getting nice and tall, almost as if you think about this S as a string and you're trying to pull it from either end. So that's something too really important that we emphasize as well, is finding that elongation as well. So I know that there will be some questions. I'm going to answer some that were there. One was about, should you do exercises that bias one side? Should you continue to do exercises that use both sides? And I think that we do want to incorporate both. We do want to incorporate exercises that use both sides, but we do want to incorporate exercises that are unilateral so we can find maybe where individually we have some of these asymmetries. So, you may do, let's say, a lunge and notice, wow, my right leg is much harder to do than my left leg. Or you may do a row and notice that, oh, it's really harder to pull my right arm than it is to my left. Or you may do a side plank and notice the side plank on my right side versus my left is really, a big difference side to side. So what I usually recommend for my clients is to try on both sides and to see which one is actually harder. If you notice one side being harder, then work a little bit more on that side, maybe more sets, so it can catch up with the other side. So a common question I get a lot is about side plank. Should you side plank on both sides? Should you modify your side plank based on that? And there's been some discussion about it. We go back and forth about it, I think, in the scoliosis world, that if you have a lumbar curve, usually it's recommended that you would side plank on that lumbar curve side. But I usually have my clients do both and maybe do a little bit more emphasis on the lumbar curve side, but also work the thoracic curve side, focusing on finding their alignment in that 3 dimensions. So making sure that their ribs are not rotating, making sure that their pelvis is staying facing forward. So there's a lot of pieces to this that we can pay attention to and add elements as well. I also had a question from someone about kyphosis and how that might relate to scoliosis. So actually, many people with scoliosis don't necessarily have also kyphosis. What is thought to be the kyphosis is actually the rotation of the curve, where we see that prominence sticking out. And actually the side of their concave, they're actually a little bit sunken in. So what we're seeing there is more so the rotation and less so an actual kyphosis spine. But there are some people who do have kyphosis as well as scoliosis. So what's really important there, actually, when we're talking about kyphosis, is that kyphosis changes the shape of the rib cage a bit. So basically, if we were looking from the top down at the rib cage, we would see the sternum in the front, we would see the vertebrae on the back, and kyphosis, because the spine is rounding away, makes that vertebrae move even further away. So what happens is, instead of our ribs being that natural oval, now they're becoming more like a barrel. And I'm exaggerating this, of course. So really a good cue, and a cue for our clients with scoliosis as well, is to practice breathing where you're pushing out into the ribs. So even like putting your hands on the sides of your ribs and pushing out into the sides to kind of open that up, to kind of reshape and use the rib dynamics and that breathing to try to pull this to come back forward. It's work. It takes some time. It takes some time to get there. We also, with clients who have kyphosis, do a lot of strengthening for their postural muscles, which is very important as well. So that's something that we do too, if the kyphosis and scoliosis. So I'll stick around. Do people have questions on this? I think that I went through a good amount of material. Sometimes can be a bit confusing. So if you have questions, I will hang out for a few more minutes just to answer them. I know that we hit on a lot of questions in terms of curve side to side, if there's a difference. I'm just going through to see if we had any other questions about this. All right. I hope that those who were looking to join us live have found us, that we're still here. So looks like we still have some people tuning in. If you have a question for me, you can leave a comment. If you can't think of one right now, you could always come back and I will comment later and respond to you. But I hope that this clarifies. So the big takeaways are that scoliosis is three-dimensional. We have to consider all the dimensions in order to be able to address the curve. We use elongation, we use alignment techniques in order to do that. We talked about how we use our blocks to line up. And then we talked about that there is some idea of weak versus strong in terms of the muscles on the sides of the spine. We do often think that the concave side tends to be weaker in many cases, but it's not always the case. And we can't always make the association that if a muscle is tight, it's weak, or if it's lengthened, it's weak. Muscles can live in kind of those spectrums of. Oh, great. So we have some questions. Let me answer these. So someone asked, if you have a fusion in rods with a thoracic prominence, the 3C curve, are you putting undue stress on the spine that isn't fused? So this is a great question. I think this goes into a little bit about adjacent segment changes. I know that this is a concern that many people have when you've had a fusion. You want to make sure that the other areas are protected, right? So in general, what we find is that it depends on the length of the fusion. It depends on if you still have some compensatory curve remaining. So maybe you had a 3 curve that had a bigger lumbar curve. Maybe you didn't. Maybe there's not much of that curve remaining, right? So if we take this example and we say, okay, I have rods here. Now this is straight. Am I putting more tension here? And what I found is actually that really the most important thing for those unfused segments is that we give them support. Some will say, okay, well, those are the only segments you can move through, so you have to be a little bit more careful. Yes, that is true, right? Because now this section moves as one block and we have all the movement going through these little segments. So I would say, for my clients who have had spinal fusions, that you can really focus on working on stabilizing those segments below the fusion. This is so important. And to learn how to move in a way that you are using your hips as well as not always bending directly through your spine segments. Now, not that bending through your spine segments is necessarily a bad thing, because it's not. We actually do want those segments to move, but what can happen is over time is they may develop a little bit more movement than what we want to. And then we worry about, sometimes the surgeon wants to come in and fuse lower, which is not what we want to. So you're not necessarily putting undue stress on the spine that isn't fused. but you can definitely improve even more your outcome if you are working to stabilize around those segments, keeping your core very strong, keeping the muscles of your hips very strong, keeping your glutes very strong. I've seen this in my clients. The glutes are so important, especially if you have a bit longer fusion there as well. All right. I hope that answers your question. If you had more, go ahead and drop it in. Do people tend to have pain more in the convex area or the concave area? My concave side feels like a burning pain. So this is interesting. I see a mix of both. And that's why I don't think that necessarily what we're looking at in terms of the research always equates to, okay, is this convex side weaker? Is this concave side weaker? So I do tend to see a variety. I tend to see more the convex area pain than the concave. And the reason is because often, depending on the alignment, the convex muscles are working so hard to hold you up. So that's definitely one of the big things here. If you are leaning more to the right, those convex muscles are working super hard to hold that alignment, and they may actually be overworked. So we may just need to work on strengthening the muscles on the convex side to help balance that out and to help find that center point for them. So sometimes we can have also that people will have pain on the concave side. And with the concave side, I think sometimes that happens because of what we would call is almost that collapse in the concave side. So really that, the ribs are coming closer together, the muscles are getting a little bit more pinched on that side. And we can actually work a lot on that by elongating the spine and also teaching the muscles on the concave side to work better with specific exercises. We do that a lot with our Schroth exercises. We do that a lot with our unilateral strength training work. So that is something that you can work on. But again, this is why I think that scoliosis does need a very specific approach. And so that's why I think that, as I always say, working with someone who has experience on this is so important. So, okay, we had a question about, I'm finding that doing abdominal exercises is particularly hard on my low back, lying down, lifting my legs. How do I compensate for this? So this is something that's very common. And it's because a lot of the traditional abdominal exercises that maybe we see on YouTube or are given from like a trainer are oftentimes maybe a little too hard for us starting out. Especially if you've had a spinal fusion and you really need to work on stabilizing the core around those unfused segments. So my recommendation would be is that start with things where you're not using the legs fully straight, keeping the knees bent, that you feel that you can control, that you can engage your abdominals with it without your back wanting to lift up off the floor. If you feel your back is lifting up off the floor, it's probably an indication that your abdominals are not strong enough to yet stabilize that area. So that may be an indication you need to work a little bit at a lower level before moving up to a higher exercise for that. So that's a great question. How should you sleep if you have left thoracic, right lumbar? Oh my gosh, now we're going into questions completely outside of the topic of today's live, but I will answer them quickly. There is nothing about sleeping on one side or the other. You can sleep on either side, find which one is comfortable for you. If you feel that when you're sleeping on the convex side of either curve that you feel it's sinking in, it's uncomfortable, sometimes you can use a very flat pillow to help support that side. But truthfully, when you're sleeping, you're moving around, it's hard to keep that perfect position on one side or the other. And what we found is that it doesn't make too much difference in terms of the curve changing or progressing how you sleep. So find what's comfortable, find what you're going to get your best sleep with. That's the most important thing. Great. Okay, I'm just checking if there's other questions. I see that a few are still tuning in live. If you have other questions, go ahead. I'll like the ones that I answered, so we know we got those. I'm glad that people tuned in, that I hope that you got something out of this. I hope that it was clear. Feel free to reach out, ask more questions. If you have a question about your particular case, you can always send me a DM, and I'll try to direct you the best I can. But I hope that this clarified some things. I hope that it gives you some good ideas of maybe what might be going on in your curve. But remember, each person's individual. So what's happening in one person's curve may not be happening exactly the same in another person's curve. So that, I think, is one of the closing statements here, is that we do see some patterns with scoliosis, but it still is very individual. So please reach out with questions. Thank you for those who tuned in. If you're watching this on the replay, tag me, ask a question. I'll come back and answer them. And if you have more questions going forward, you know that this group is always an open space for you, and reach out at any time. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye.